Okay, so we're going to get started today. You got two handouts. The first one is the exercise 104, which is what we'll be doing today. I will walk you through all of the stuff that we're doing. So it won't be something where I just leave you out to work through. So we'll get through everything step by step, and I'll show you the whole process. But the other handout that you got is your first assignment for the class. And remember, the assignments collectively are worth 40% of your overall grade. So they're worth about 7% each. If we work out the math. So this is your first one. It's a pretty simple one. I start off rather easy. It's simply to pick what you consider to be your best photograph and submit that as your image for this particular assignment. It is due on the 17th, so that's in a week. I know it's a short turnaround, but it's only one photo. It's not that bad. So don't panic over it. It's due on the 17th. Remember, it has to be turned in before class starts on the 17th. So if I start talking, it's late, if that makes sense. So before. And that's to keep you guys from coming in and you know, trying to post it while I'm talking and not paying any attention and whatever. It's just due before. It makes it easy. The photo that you pick needs to have been taken from sometime between the first day of class and now. So you can't go back to, oh, you know, I was in Italy over the summer break and I have these great photos. You can't use those. So it has to be something current. The hope is that you've thought about composition and you're not just using some recycled image. Obviously, well, at least I hope this is obvious, it should be an image that you took. Don't just pick some online image. I've had people do that in the past. You won't get full credit. You actually won't get any credit for it because it's not yours. So make sure it's yours. There is this thing online that I can do reverse image searches. So I can double check to make sure your image wasn't some image that you found online. It does exist. Okay, so just don't do that. Take your own image. You're going to post-process it using the techniques that we'll discuss this week in class, both today and on Wednesday. You don't have to do every post-processing technique that I talk about. So today, for example, one of the things that we'll talk about doing is converting an image to black and white. That doesn't mean that all of your images for this assignment need to be black and white. For some people, you might want it to be black and white, but it doesn't mean that it's just an arbitrary, you have to do everything. So you're going to pick and choose what pieces are the best for your particular image. You are going to, hold on, I'm double checking here. You are going to do two things. You're going to post it. The posted image is the one that I'm going to grade, but you're also going to print it to the colored laser printer that's across the way in the lab. It's the C5550. I think that's what they call it now. They've changed printers a few times. You're going to give me an 8.5 by 11 print of it. That means your image is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 by 10-ish in size. That's fine. It doesn't have to be the best quality. It does need to be in color if your image is in color. This gives me a paper record that you turned something in, if that makes sense. So it's not, I'm not going to grade it. You're not going to get it back. There's not going to be comments on it or anything. You're just giving it to me as a record. When you post your image online, which is the one that I am going to grade, you're going to post your original image, the image that you post-processed, so what you changed in it, what you made it, how you made it look better, and you're also going to write a paragraph that describes what it is that you did, what adjustments you performed, etc. Now, in very rare circumstances, the image that you're such a good photographer, the image that you took was perfect and you had to do absolutely nothing to it. I would highly doubt that that's the case for anybody. Even for me, who's taken you know, hundreds of thousands of pictures, they almost always need some post-processing of some kind. So you will probably have to do some post-processing, in which case you'll have to tell me about it in a paragraph. So I am looking for that paragraph. If you don't do the paragraph, you won't get full credit for the assignment. So I'm just trying to make sure I walk you guys through this on the first one. So I'm asking for the original, the post-processed image, which is your final image, and a paragraph that describes what you did. So 3 different things as part of your post. If you have questions, let me know, but that's what I'm looking for. All right, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. Obviously, you're going to comment on this once it's posted, but that's not going to be until next week once they're all posted. Okay, any questions about the assignment before we move on? No, if you're looking for you know, example images that people have turned in before, you can always look on the website and see things that people have turned in before. It doesn't mean that all of them were A's. It's all the stuff that anybody's ever turned in. So look for the best ones and go from there. Okay, so today we're going to talk about post-processing photographs and developing a digital workflow. And I used to spend more time talking about photo management applications and how you might organize your photo library. And the truth is that with our phones, most of what we do is just take the picture and it lives on our phones. So some of this has gotten a little bit outdated, I guess would be the right way to say it. However, when you go to take really high quality photographs, you're going to want to go through these kinds of post-processing techniques because they're going to make a huge difference in your images. I'm going to show you some examples today where hopefully you'll be able to see what a big difference it makes. When you pick your images to work with for your exercise portion of the class, you should be able to see some dramatic differences using some of the techniques. So a workflow is essentially a set of steps that a photographer goes through after they have captured images. So it's something that is repetitive, it's something that you always kind of know happens, and it's how you get from taking the image to having a final image. The workflow is always going to vary by the photographer, and it's always going to vary by what's the intended outcome, what's the end result of what it is that you're working on. Generally, the workflow begins with going out and taking the images in the first place. So you're not going to have a workflow unless you have an image to start with. The next step generally involves getting the images from your camera or from your phone into your computer. It might involve organizing them in some kind of a software package. Maybe that's Lightroom or maybe it's Photos if you have a Mac. Kind of trying to organize it and figure out how they fit in with all the photos that you've taken. And next you'll go through and do some post-processing. And you heard me talk about post-processing when I was talking about Assignment 101. And the idea of post-processing is just, here's the raw image. What am I going to do to make it look a little bit better? And there's little techniques that can make a big difference on the image if you get used to those as you go through it. And it could be something as simple as cropping. It could be something as simple as converting an image to black and white. It's going to vary depending on what your desired result is going to be. For me personally, it's almost 100% guarantee that when I take a photo and I do post-processing on it, I'm going to need to do a levels adjustment. And I'm going to talk about what a levels adjustment is. But that's almost always the case for any image that I take. So it's something that I know in my workflow, it's always going to involve a little bit of levels work. It may be the case with you. It may not be the case with you. These are the kinds of things that you'll learn as you go through and process more and more images. And then finally, you're going to put your photo somewhere. And it could be as simple as putting it on Instagram. Could be putting it on Facebook. Could be uploading it to Flickr. Could be doing some kind of a shared album through iPhoto or Photos. It could be sending it to your mom. I don't know. There's some intended output in this photograph. In our class, the intended output is obviously posting it on the course website. You probably already have some kind of workflow, and it might be as simple as I took my phone out, I took a picture, I opened Instagram, maybe I took the picture in Instagram, I put a little filter on it, and I posted it. That's technically a workflow. So it works for some of you, it might be that simple. You might also think about what software you plan to use. Are you going to be in the professional realm where you need something really robust to manage your images? How are you going to back up your images? Where do they live? Are you worried about losing them? All those kinds of things you want to think about. If you know that, for me, I always do a levels adjustment, that's the first thing I'm going to do. Is as I look at my image, download it into my computer, boom, I do the levels adjustment. Are there any steps you can automate? You can set up automated actions that do things for you. Sometimes the photo application that you're using has an auto button, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, but you might be able to automate some of these processes to make it a little bit easier, and you want to think about how those photos are ultimately going to be used. Anybody seen those billboards that are in San Francisco as you drive in that say shot with an iPhone, and they have the big picture? I mean, I guess they must be shot with an iPhone, but printing something that large from a camera that small is pretty iffy. I mean, the circumstances of that image had to have been absolutely perfect to have it be that good and to be printed that large. So you want to think about how big is it ultimately going to be? And do you have the resolution? Do you have the clarity to print it that large and have it look that good? So what about software? Are you on a Windows? Are you on a Mac computer? It's going to vary depending on what your options are. Are you on your own computer? Are you on a laptop? Are you in the lab? Do you just have access to online? Are you trying to do it on an iPad? What is it that you're trying to work with? That's going to change. The next thing is something called non-destructive editing. And non-destructive editing is a big one. And the idea behind non-destructive editing is when you make a change to your photo, is it permanent or is it temporary? And the best kinds of editors are these non-destructive ones where it's a temporary change. And I don't mean temporary in that you can do Control-Z and undo to undo what you did. I mean, can you selectively turn on or turn off the adjustment that you provided? I did a levels adjustment. I keep working with the image. I ultimately make it black and white. I keep working with it. I adjust some vibrancy, and I say, you know what? I really want it to go back to color. Can I uncheck the box for black and white? Can I turn off the adjustment layer and have it immediately back in color? That's non-destructive editing. And that's really valuable when you're working on photo post-processing, because you may decide that you really liked it better before, or you want to turn something off. Are you going to be in the free realm? Usually that's good for, let's say, 1 to 10,000 images. Are you going to be in the professional? You're a professional photographer. You need 50,000 images. You've got these giant image libraries. You're kind of stuck with the professional route. So what are our free options that are out there in terms of software? There's a bunch online that are actually pretty decent. Google Photos isn't bad. It's an example of Google Photos. You can go to it at photos.google.com. There's pretty easy presets. You can say, I want the image to look like this. You click on that image. It does the processing for you. It's pretty easy. Obviously, it's integrated into Google, so if you have a Gmail account, it's pretty easy to email it and do that sort of thing with it. There aren't too many advanced editing features. You're not going to find a levels adjustment there or anything, no curves, for example. You obviously have to have a connection to the internet because it's an online application, and it's semi-destructive. It depends on once you've kind of baked your edits, it sticks. But you've got some when you're working on it, you can go back. So it's once you commit to it that it gets a little bit destructive. Photoshop Express Editor, they're pushing. It used to be online, and they're pushing a lot more into the it's got to be on a device. It's got to be on your iPad. It's got to be on your Android tablet or your phone or whatever. It has some pretty good presets built into it, which is nice. It's kind of the bare minimum. It gets you by. You can do some decent post-processing. It has a few advanced features. You obviously have to have a connection to the internet, as is the case with most of these. It is ultimately a destructive editor, so the changes that you make are going to be permanent, and you're not going to be able to go back. And obviously, it requires a phone or a tablet. Pixlr is an online app, and this one is almost identical to Photoshop, except it's online. So you can go there and you can use almost all the features that are available in Photoshop just by going online. It's even set up like Photoshop, which is kind of bizarre. So you can get a lot out of it. The big thing that it doesn't have is it doesn't have adjustment layers. And that's what you get out of Photoshop that you don't get out of this. But other than that, you can do almost anything in it. And it can be a pretty good strategy if you don't want to pay for the Creative Cloud subscription and have Photoshop on your computer, because you can do almost anything that you can do with Photoshop in here. So it's definitely something that's worth noting. It does require Flash, so it's not going to work on your iPad if you go, because iPads don't support Flash. So you have to be aware that you need a computer. It needs to have Flash installed in order to use it. But like I said, it's pretty good. Photos, which is the new, it's not really new anymore, but it's the photo management app that comes with your Mac if you have a Mac. If you have an iPhone or an iPad, it's going to come on that as well. And it has a lot of the editing features built into it. It has things like curves and your levels adjustments, selective dodge and burn, retouching, and all the things that you would typically do in Photoshop. Just built into it. It has really good metadata support, so things that are baked into your image, we'll talk about EXIF data in a little bit later, and what that metadata is. You can access it and work with it. It organizes your images. It automatically backs up your images. It syncs between your devices. You take it on your phone. It shows up on your iPad, those kinds of things. Photoshop or Lightroom, which is Adobe's product, which I'll talk about in just a second, has a similar way of working with all of your devices. Professional options, there's really only one company that makes the professional options. It's Adobe. They have two products that are in the photography realm. The first one is called Lightroom. Lightroom is their photo management application. So this is, how do you control, I have 50,000 images, how do I organize those images, how do I back them up, how do I work with them? That's their management application. It has a lot of really great tools built into it. You can do levels adjustment, you can do curves adjustments, you can do retouches, kind of the same things that Apple's Photos has is all built into Lightroom, which lets you not actually leave Lightroom and go into Photoshop, which is the other one. We're getting to that. The difference between Photoshop, and again, I'll talk about this in a slide, is just that Photoshop doesn't have the management part of it. It doesn't organize your photos, doesn't keep track of them for you. So they're a little bit stepping on each other's toes, but it's a really good professional option, but obviously you have to have a Creative Cloud subscription that has the photo bundle built into it. So you have to be able to get Lightroom as part of it. So it does cost. And the last one, which is Adobe Photoshop, is what we're going to work on today, what I'm going to teach you to work with today, and we're actually going to work on it for the next couple weeks in this class. It is definitely non-destructive, so we can go back, interchangeably change what we turned on, what we turned off as we go through. You'll see that today. It is really the most advanced photo editor that's available. You could do pixel by pixel corrections. You could even, if you were a painter, you could paint in Photoshop, and there are people who actually paint like paintings in Photoshop. It's pretty impressive. Work is stored on layers. Layers can be combined through different blending modes. We'll talk about blending modes next class and how those work together. There's a lot of power that's in Photoshop. The difference between this and any of the other applications that I talked about is that it doesn't organize your photos at all. You take a single photo, you open it in Photoshop, you make your changes, you export that photo, you can save the Photoshop file so you can go back and make changes later. That's it. It doesn't keep track of your photos. It doesn't look at metadata on your photos. It doesn't organize your photos in any way. It's just the editor. That's all it does. But it's really, really good at editing. So organizing images. Again, this is the part that Photoshop doesn't do, but Lightroom would do, or the Apple applications would do. The first thing that I want to talk about is something called metadata, and this is data that's stored within your photograph. And maybe you guys had an aunt. I had an aunt who did this, who was really big on this, that took film photos, like back in the day. And the cameras from then, when you took your photos, would put a little orange date in the corner. And they would like stamp it permanently into the photo. That was the earliest form of this metadata. In our world, in the digital world, the things like the date don't get stamped on the photo. We don't see it, but they get recorded at the same time as taking a particular photo. So if I look at this here, for example, I've pulled up a bunch of metadata about a photograph. It doesn't matter that the photograph is in here, but this is stuff that was automatically stored when I shot this particular image. And we can see right here, it tells me what my camera was and what lens I had connected to the camera. It also tells me what the ISO, and these are all things we talked about last class. It was shot at an ISO of 125. The lens was zoomed at 62 millimeter. It had a 0 exposure value. The aperture was 5.6. The shutter speed was 1/500th of a second. So it stored all of that information about the particular photo. As we come down a little bit further and look down here at the bottom, it tells me more stuff. It tells me when I shot the photo. Obviously, you can tell this slide is old. I shot the photo in 2008. Some of you were like babies in 2008. Not quite, but you know what I mean. It tells me what the size of the image was, etc. Now, it will also tell me, if I shot it with a camera or with a phone, where I shot that photo based on GPS tagging. So you guys remember when you first opened up your phone, you probably don't even remember this, and you opened up that camera app for the first time, it said, hey, can I use your location? And you said, yeah, whatever. Which is what everybody does. Yeah, whatever, no big. Yeah, go ahead, use my location. That's giving it permission to tag every photo with where you shot it. So your GPS location, in addition to the, the date and the time and everything else you recorded, it also took the actual physical location, which is great if you're organizing your photos because you can tell where you took them. You can tell I took all these photos at DVC. Makes it really easy. So based on that information, we can organize our photos. We have a variety of organization strategies, from albums to facial recognition, events. All of those things come into play here. I'll go through them really quickly. A lot of these are self-explanatory. An album is essentially like the old school books that your mom has tucked away in the closet, where you manually go through and you say, I want all of these images into this album. And you kind of drag them over. It's the digital equivalent of that. You can have smart albums. You could say, show me all the images that I've shot that had an aperture of 1.8. Show me all the images that I've shot that had a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. You could do those kinds of albums too if you want. Events is just a little bit more sophisticated than an album. And the idea here is that when you're shooting photos, you typically like, oh, I'm going to a birthday party, I'll take a bunch of pictures. And they're grouped together. And then you don't take pictures for a while, and then you go to somebody's house for dinner and you might take a few more pictures. So the computer's smart enough to know that typically the groups of photos that you take are separate events. And so it can separate those out automatically for you. We don't take one picture every 30 seconds our whole life. It doesn't work that way. So clusters are really easy to group together. Makes it easy to identify, hey, these are events that happen. These are groupings of photos that all belong together. Faces and facial recognition is really technology that's available readily on all these kinds of computers. Essentially, you tell the computer, this is me, this is my wife, this is my girlfriend, whatever. It then recognizes all the other photos that you take with that person in it using facial recognition. It was kind of interesting how they rolled this out. It was a very subtle process, and it didn't really work that well, and it was a little gimmicky, and it kept asking you, like, are you sure it's this person and whatever? The truth is that the technology has been there for a long time, and it's really easy for computers to figure out who's who. And so now they've kind of baked it in. It's pretty obvious. It recognizes people relatively easily without too many errors. The last thing, places. This is where you shot particular photos. Again, this is when you shoot it with your camera or a GPS-enabled, when you shoot it with your phone or any kind of a GPS-enabled camera, it tags the physical location in addition to all the rest of the information. So you can look on a map and say, here's all the pictures I shot in Rome, or whatever. So let's go through the typical adjustments, and these are the ones that we're going to talk about today. And again, the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk visibly up here and show you some examples, but then we'll actually do it all together, and I'll walk you through it. Because when you're working with your own image and you can actually see it happen, it makes a lot more sense as to what, especially when we get to like the curves adjustment. The curves isn't going to make any sense when I talk about it up here until you actually do it. So first one, really easy, crop and resize. Cropping, adjusting, making sure you follow the rule of thirds, you have a good composition. That's what this is about. Remember that you can only crop to make the image smaller. You can't make it bigger. So if you're taking your images, give yourself extra space around them and then crop down later versus taking an image that's too tight and then wishing you had more image because you can't get more image back. A lot of Photoshop has built in. You see the grid, the rule of thirds grid. When you go to do a crop, that rule of thirds will show up and help you organize. You can also change certain aspect ratios. There's other things that you can lock into place so you have, oh, this is going to be a 4:3 ratio or this is a 16:9 ratio, depending on what ratio and what your end format is going to be if you're printing it, etc. Sometimes you end up cropping into a square, but you see that that rule of thirds is still always there to help you set things up. I would love to work here. This would be fantastic. Just sit here and work. It would be awesome. Great composition, though. Exposure. If you didn't shoot your image correctly in the first place, especially if it's a raw image, you can actually lighten up or change the exposure of an image after the fact. You can say, oh, this image was a little bit too dark. Let me go ahead and lighten it up. Generally, lightening an image, going from dark to light, is easy. Even if you have a JPEG image, you can do that. If it's dark, or excuse me, if it's light and you want to make it darker, the only way it's going to really work is if you have a raw image, in which case it might work. So here's an example. Image on the left is definitely too dark. You do that exposure adjustment, you get the image on the right, and it's exposed correctly now. Brightness and contrast. This is overall brightness of the image, overall difference between light and dark of an image. The truth is that this is a really heavy-handed tool. It's kind of like working on a fine little model and then getting out a sledgehammer and deciding you're going to work with it. Like it's really big and nasty. So yes, it works. Yes, you can make something stand out a little bit more. Yes, you can have this brightness contrast, but it's not really the fine-tooth comb that we'd like to work with. So instead, we might do something like a levels adjustment, which I'll talk about in a bit. Color, saturation, or vibrance. This is if the color tones of the image are incorrect. We can correct that. I had some friends that asked me over the weekend. They said, hey, our photographer couldn't come take pictures of the family. would you come and take pictures? And I said, sure. You know, I got a free hour. I'll come take your pictures. And I didn't have my camera, and it was kind of this last minute thing. And I shot with somebody else's camera. Shot with their camera. And afterward, I downloaded all the images, and the white balance was off on every single image. Everything was blue. And so I had to go back through and on every image correct that after the fact. So this is something that you can absolutely do in Photoshop, and you can adjust those kinds of things. You can also adjust saturation and vibrance. And I like to make a point of explaining the difference here, because frequently you guys will be working in Photoshop and you won't understand the difference between saturation and vibrance. In both cases, we're boosting color values in the final image. The difference between saturation and vibrance is that saturation boosts all color values. We get more color for everything, including skin tone colors. So you can see here that the boy in the photograph has become a little bit more orange because there's more skin tone colors coming through. Vibrance, on the other hand, does the same thing, but it avoids all the skin tone colors. So it's going to push out the greens and the blues, but not touch the skin tone colors. So if you're trying to do an adjustment that has people in it, and you want more of this color value, more saturation in the image, you're going to do a vibrance adjustment, not a saturation adjustment. The two in Photoshop are side by side, so it's easy to see them and to control them. We'll play around with it a little bit today, and you'll see it, though it's not a required one that we'll work with. Black and white, or sepia. Sepia is essentially brown and white instead of black and white. We'll talk about making an image in black and white. Sometimes making an image in black and white is fantastic. Sometimes it's not the right move, and we have to experiment with that. I want to show you the right way to convert an image to black and white, because there's the wrong way. And so we need to make sure that you're in the right way, and I'll show you that today as we go forward. Focus. So this is something I like to bring up because there are things like sharpening and focus that are available in Photoshop. But I like to tell you, or I want to emphasize to you, that this is not something that can suddenly magically correct a blurry image. If the image is blurry, it's always going to be blurry. There's one camera that's on the market that touts that it can go back and make it not blurry. Essentially what it's doing is it's shooting video and then picking the still frame. You can, however, make very small adjustments in edge pixels to make something a little bit sharper. So we're not correcting blurry image, we're adding a little bit of definition. And this is one of those things where I can show you it in person, and it'll make more difference. So here we have two images, one of which has had this adjustment performed to it. And if you look really carefully at the edges of the pages, and it's on the projector, so it's really hard to see, there's a slight blur to the edges of the pages here, and there's just a little bit more localized contrast here. So you can pick out the edges just a little bit more. They're crisper. And so it's hard, like I said, to see it on this, but you can do it in Photoshop after the fact. And when you do that kind of sharpening, you can actually get just a little bit more out of a particular image. It's localized contrast. Red eye reduction. You guys have obviously seen red eye before. Does anybody know why red eye happens in the first place? Exactly. So what happens is you're in a dark room, somebody wants to take a picture of you, and you're standing there. They get out their phone or their camera or whatever, and they take a picture. The flash on most of our cameras is right next to the camera lens. So when you shoot and that flash goes off, the light goes right out, bounces off the backs of your eyes, it goes through your iris, bounces off the back, it comes back out as red. Then we get our red eye. So cameras have gotten a little bit smarter. The red eye reduction, the flashes that happen first, what they're doing is they're saying, camera, I want to take a picture of you. I'll flash first before I actually take the picture to try to shrink down your iris so it's not so wide open. Shrink it down, there's less that's going to reflect, and then I'll take the picture. So that's why the flashes happen first. We can also deal with it after the fact in Photoshop. Really easily, we can just retouch that and get rid of it. So one way or the other. The other thing that you can do is separate where the flash is and where the camera is. So instead of having the flash right next to the lens of the camera, you separate those out, you don't get red eye. If you've been to a wedding, the wedding photographers are notorious for this. They always have their camera, and then they have some kind of a contraption that holds their flash away from the camera. You've seen this, right? At a wedding, if you've been to a wedding. Or they bounce it off the ceiling or whatever. That's a really good way of adding light without getting the red eye. Levels. I talked a bunch about levels today. I keep coming back to levels. This is an adjustment of an image that corrects where true black is and true white is in an image. And I'll come back to this slide. It's easier to flip back and forth as I try to explain this. And again, this is one of those examples where you'll get a lot more out of me doing it live in front of you than anything else. So on the image that's on the left here, this was the original image. This is the one that has the levels adjustment. And so what levels is doing is we're looking at this image and we're saying, okay, on this image, where is the darkest black on this image? Well, maybe it's like right in there under the shadow, maybe. But is that really black black, or is it just dark gray? In this image, that color is kind of a dark gray, not really black. Similarly, if we were to look at this image and we were to say, what is white on this image? Is there anything that's actually white on this image? Well, there's a little dot here. There's this peeling paint is maybe a little bit white. But they're really just light gray. They're not true white in this image. So what we do when we do the levels adjustment is we say, let's make this part right here, oops, that part right there, let's make that actually black. And let's take this little dot and or this little piece and let's make that white. And when we do that, we pinch down black and white and we say this is a true spectrum from black all the way to white. And it really brings out the texture and the color in an image. You can see that they're distinctly different images. So when you do this live, it's going to make a lot more sense. Let me flip back for just a second to the actual graph. So here's what's called the histogram of that particular image that I was just looking at. So this chart represents the image. And you see the gray graph that kind of goes like this right here? That is the distribution of pixels at each value of gray. So I have maybe right here, I have maybe 1 black pixel. And then I come over a little bit more and I have 10 dark gray pixels. And then I come over a little bit more and I'm suddenly here and I have 35 medium gray. And obviously it's more like 35,000 medium gray, but you get the idea. So if I were to count up all those different values, if I get here, that's kind of a medium gray, a little bit more, I have the biggest number of those. And then it tapers off and finally I come all the way back down to where I have 1 kind of very light gray pixel. It's not really white. And all I'm doing is I'm saying, instead, let's take true white, which would be here, and pull it all the way over to that point. So true white, pull it over to that point. Now that's true white. True black, pull it all the way over to that point. Now that's true black. That's what I'm doing. I'm saying black is black, white is white, and redistribute those pixels on my graph. Again, it'll make a lot more sense when we do it live, and I'll do it with you. So the next one that's even more confusing is something called curves. And essentially this is like levels adjustment, but we can do it to just parts of the image. So we can say, let's just work the light areas of the image. Let's just work the dark areas of the image and change those. It's almost impossible for me to stand up here and explain how this works. I'll show you the example. We can go from this to that. It's a better image, uses some adjustments. But it's not something that I can sit here and explain how it works. So we're going to do it on the computer live, and you'll see it happen. And that'll make a whole lot more sense. Another example here of curves. The images are similar, but the image on the right is better because of those curves adjustments. And then we get to the final results. Are you posting on Facebook? Are you posting on Instagram? Are you going to go print them? What's your final result going to be? And then, obviously, how are you going to achieve that final result? Maybe it's posting to a web gallery, etc. So we're going to switch from the lecture format here over onto the school computer, and I'm going to show you how we're going to post-process these images, and I'll do live examples. I want you to pick, I think it's 3 images. Let me just double check here. Yeah, I want you to pick 3 of your favorite images from the ones that you took last class or over the weekend. Pick 3 of those, and we're going to work with 3 different images. I want you to pick 3, even though it's redundant, because not all post-processing techniques work on all images. So it's helpful to have 3 different ones to work through. So I'm going to switch over, and I don't think they installed the recording software on the school computer yet. So if you need to watch me after the fact, or you lose track of what I was doing, you'll have to go back and watch last year's lecture because they still haven't put that on for me yet. Okay.